Welcome back to the Mold Show. I am your host, Adam Horn, and as always, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Sean McGrath. Sean, how are you doing, man? How have things been? It's been stressful, crazy out there for everybody, especially I'm sure those who follow our show, or if you're in the Florida area. It's been a trying month, couple weeks. I don't even know. I've lost track of time. It's wild.
Hey, Adam. Yeah, I don't know about that esteemed guest intro there. I'll take it. But it's good to be back. Last time we actually recorded 2 shows, and I'm glad we did because, man, it's been a crazy few weeks. Our area was hit really hard by Milton, but I think the overlooked storm was actually Helene. We got hit really hard down here, and I think we were kind of overlooked just because of the craziness that was happening in North Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and rightfully so. People were paying attention to that and worried about what's going on there. But our area was hit the hardest I've seen in the 30 plus years I've lived in Tampa. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I've done a lot of storm work, a lot of cat work. I'm a former adjuster. And usually I tell people at the beginning of the show, I'm a Florida state licensed mold remediator. Sean is a Florida state licensed mold assessor. But in a former life, I was also a property insurance adjuster. It's kind of how I got my start in this industry, and then worked in all facets, and now on the restoration side as a remediator. But I've been around a lot of hurricanes, including Katrina for a hot minute. You know, there's always devastation, but when it hits home, it's different. You know, when I've been out on cat duty before, and it's not my area, not my neighborhood, not, you know, an area I frequent, something's different. Driving down Gulf Boulevard in Pinellas, seeing the devastation you've seen on TV in other areas, or in person if you've ever been around storm damage, you know, or down in the Sarasota Bradenton area. You know, words can't put into perspective what that devastation is like, and ultimately what it does to people. You know, most people have no clue where to start, where to go, and you know, they've been just displaced, disrupted, and their home has been destroyed. And man, it's been tough. I've ingested a lot of it, you know, just visually, and this is not an exaggeration, the hundreds of phone calls I've had, you know, in trying to get people into the right hands to start the process of figuring out how to handle it, how to deal with it, how to put their lives back together, who to call, what to do. There's just so many questions, and you know, that we've wanted to hop on here, like Sean said, but I lost, you know, no complaints here, you know, minimal damage, lost power, and then having to, you know, we work in the industry, so been tough, man, really has.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to apologize to people because we've been doing a pretty good job of coming out with this bi-weekly, but it was just impossible the last couple of weeks. We lost power for several days, internet all messed up, work schedules just thrown out the window. And like you said, it's been impossible to take all the phone calls we've received over the last couple of weeks. So we're a few days late. I think actually we were supposed to release one yesterday, right?
Yeah.
My clock's showing 10 o'clock here on a Wednesday night. But we've got our coffee. We're ready to go. We're ready to talk about it. Hopefully we can get through sharing our experience for those that might want to know what it was like during the storm, because it was a pretty crazy night. And then maybe we can give some practical advice for people to take action if this were ever to happen to them, not just hurricane, but any natural disaster, any flood situation, catastrophic damage to your house. Maybe we can get through some of that, and hopefully people can take some of that, and it'll be useful.
Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be helpful for people now and you know, post storm, but the overall theme for me, having been in all these flooded homes now, is I question how they were constructed in the first place. A lot of them, being in harm's way and just not at all proofed for these type of events is a tough one. And I know building codes have changed over the years, and for good reason now. You're in those flood zones. There's a reason that those buildings are built up 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet off the ground specifically for that. And there's still a lot of older homes out there that, are on slab. And, they were built at a time where there really were no standards for that. And those are the homes that, by and large, have the most damage. When you get several feet of water in those homes, there is no coming back from that. We talked about it a little bit off air, about the types of water, the grades of water with these events. This is much different than your standard water loss from a clean water source. When water comes in from the outside like this, ocean water mixed with sewage and all the oils and greases and pesticides and who knows what
nasty
else it
ponds
carried
we
with
have
it.
down here.
Nasty, mucky ponds. When that water intrudes into your building, put mold aside for a second. It's contaminated. They consider it black water, and pretty much everything non-structural it touches in the interior of a building customarily has to be cut out and removed back down to the framing or the block or the structural substrate. So you're seeing a whole lot of that now. And Sean, you asked, or you made a point earlier that we could maybe kind of shed some light on the types of water events and the grades of water. And, I think a lot of people are getting a bit of a crash course on what that is and what to do. There's different categories. The worst is, what we're dealing with these floods is considered category 3 or black water. There's a category 2, which is gray water, and a category 1, which is clean water sources. And all those types of water damage exposures bring a different set of rules in regards to what to do after you've been exposed to those types of events. And like I said, this being the worst, and in this case, you're gutting, or what they call flood cutting, the building materials, interior building materials, back down to the framing, removing all floor coverings. I'm seeing a lot of people trying to salvage floor coverings and things like that. Don't particularly agree with that. Behind showers, cabinetry, pretty much everything. Trying to salvage that is a risky proposition. Hoping that it didn't expose itself or get behind shower walls and shower cavities, behind built-ins and cabinetry, is just that wishful thinking. That water's nasty. That material should come out. And ultimately, then you're dealing with the drying and sanitizing process after that.
Yeah, the IRCRC, because I've got it pulled up here, gives examples of the Category 3 water. And it includes not only the sewage and toilet backflows and things of that nature, which is probably pretty obvious to people, but all forms of flooding. Seawater, ground surface water for raising rivers or streams, even if those are freshwater streams. Also, anything entering the indoor environment like windblown rain from hurricanes, tropical storms, or weather-related events, because it can carry silt, organic matter, pesticides, as you mentioned, heavy metals, and other toxic organic substances. So it's not always just going to be the sewage backups or the obvious nasty pond water that overflows. A lot to consider when it comes to Category 3 water. And, another thing I was thinking about when you were talking about all the flooding, and it's something they're not talking about down here, is all the flooding that I think is happening from our housing boom. A lot of these builders and developers are buying these wetlands, let's call it how it is, and trying to grade them and turning them into neighborhoods. And they're not being graded, or the drainage isn't being properly set up. And because of that, there's areas that are flooding that have never flooded before.
Or have flooded before. And then they think that they've got the proper amount of infrastructure in
the
place.
secondary effect, the areas around them because
Right.
of the construction. Now those
Right.
areas are flooding because it's all being redirected.
Yeah, they're the domino effect of doing that sometimes isn't tested, or there's no way to test it. I guess they can use whatever engineering practices they use and try to do what they can to ensure that they're not going to cause an issue in an area that didn't have an issue to begin with. But we all know, and you and I being in the industry know, that just isn't the case a lot of times. And we're tested, you know, with these types of events, and you really get to see the areas where the failures have occurred. I think an area up in Sarasota made national news before Helene, where one of the subdivisions was underwater. I forget after which storm that was. They weren't in a flood zone, high and dry, Lakewood Ranch area, I think it was, in Sarasota, and that whole neighborhood was underwater after a storm, and nothing else was affected like that. So yeah, you just don't know, and living in the state's always a risk. And whether they say you're in a flood zone or not, water has a way, in some cases, of doing things that are not predictable.
So, what was your experience like during the storm? I think you actually, you didn't evacuate out of the state, but because of the type of house you lived in, you can share some of that. I think you went and
Yeah,
stayed with someone else.
I live in a higher area, supposedly 42 feet above sea level, according to my neighbor, who said he looked it up on the zoning maps, from flood zone D. But I'm also 2.5 blocks from the Hillsborough River, and mile or such from the bay. So for Helene, I wasn't that concerned, although some of the areas around me, which immediately go from D to A because we're so close to the river, did sustain flooding from the storm. We didn't. um Milton scared the living what out of me. I live in a wooden home, almost 100-year-old wooden home, and what they were talking about in regards to wind speeds, and when that one, for the first time ever, I evacuated. And thankfully I didn't sustain any kind of significant damage, but we went further north, and actually lost power where I was at, and then I'm calling my neighbors like, we got power over here. But by the time I got back, power was out for about almost about a week, and nothing to complain about, like I said, comparatively to everybody else. But that's where that was just the beginning for me. I'd already been dealing with um Helene floods, and trying to help people navigate the what to do. That week, I probably got over 100 phone calls for emergency services, flood mitigation, for water extraction, for dry outs, those types of things. And yeah, man, that in regards to how it affected me was the one. Milton was like more of like the windstorm traditional damage, a lot of wind damage. The tornadoes, we saw the areas that really were devastated. Got hit by a lot of those tornadoes, and I think I saw a video of a 40-yard dumpster on somebody's roof that just kind of shows you the power of those things, man. Unbelievable. Excuse me, unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm glad you did evacuate the type of house you're in, because
Yeah.
I can't imagine how scary that would have been. You've got the crawl space under your house, the
Yeah.
older home, just wood home, and the way the winds were whipping through here was like nothing I've ever seen. So I
Yeah.
have videos of the wind just whipping down the street. We actually stayed at my brother and sister's in laws, and I'm
Yeah, I've
glad
got
we.
videos my neighbor took too, and yeah, it was terrifying. And then once my cameras went out, so I couldn't like obsessively sit there and watch my camera feeds, just looking at, like, hearing the audio of the cameras, and watching just limb after limb after limb just cover my entire backyard towards my house. Thankfully, most of them stayed off of the roofs. Some of my outbuildings got some damage, but nothing we couldn't correct. But yeah, I mean, once again, as far as the Tampa Bay area, most of the areas, were, because of the storm, stayed a little bit south again. I think we were lucky to not get the brunt of the storm, and I guess the angle of the storm and all that type of thing, and where the tides were when it came in. A lot of it ultimately ended up being favorable for us, but that's not the case for a lot of people.
I'm glad we went and stayed with my brother and sister-in-law. I sent you a video of us, our street literally flooded up to my knees. Thankfully, didn't get in the house. I think it got farther up the driveway than we think, because my wife's car had some water intrusion through the trunk.
Yeah.
So I think it was up a lot higher than we thought. But it took a few days for it to go down for us to even be able to get to our house. So I'm glad we were at my in-laws' house and able to at least get in and out of the neighborhood after the storm.
Yeah,
But we had friends that just were not as lucky. I mean, I spent the whole weekend helping people get things out of their home, getting all the drywall out as quickly as possible, just because they had 3 feet of water in their home and lost almost everything.
Yeah, the rivers, the Hillsborough River and the Cypress Creek out towards Pasco flooded a lot of communities out there. You were probably affected, by a lot of that. I had a friend who had to get airboated off of his front lawn, as a result, and that was 3 days after the storm. The water kept rising and rising and rising and rising. Just from the reserve over there continuing to come back, and had all that additional water in there. And I think a lot of places out there had that type of, man, it's almost a different terrifying experience, because it's you think you made it, right? You're like, man, we got lucky, right? And then next thing you know, 2 days later, the water's still rising in your neighborhood. That's a different level of torture. And I know some of those communities were built up because knowing that they're in low-lying land, but a lot of people, like you said, weren't, and ultimately got flooding in areas they didn't anticipate, and they don't have flood insurance, and and they're having to handle these things, and they never dreamed that something like this could affect their homes, and it's devastating, man.
Well, let's talk about some practical steps people can take in maybe the first 24 to 72 hours. If you were to ever have a flooding event in your home from something like this, what's some practical things people can do in those first few days, Adam?
Well, I want to say something about the water damage industry. We don't have nearly enough resources. There's only enough to handle a normal level of devastation. So I know that a lot of people were calling for companies to try to get them to come out and help them, and ultimately had to figure out how to do it themselves. And so you may find yourself in that situation where you can't find help, or you can't afford to hire help. And then, so where do you begin? And it's a tough thing to ask people who have never dealt with this before to handle it themselves, but you should know at least what you're dealing with, and maybe get some perspective on how, and how you can handle it, what you could potentially salvage, and how to prepare for the inevitability that something like this could happen to you again if you live in an area that could be impacted. And that really just concludes most of the state of Florida. I think most people are realizing that now, that it's unpredictable, and just because you're not in a flood zone doesn't mean you can't be devastated by these events. And so I'll say this: if you find yourself in the unfortunate situation where your home or building or business has been flooded, drying it should be the least of your worries initially. Hopefully you've taken some of your more important belongings and put them out of harm's way, but you're in that situation. You walk in, you've had 4 feet of water in your home. Getting the wet material out is the most imperative piece of the puzzle. You need to remove all of your belongings, and we'll go into can you salvage belongings that have been in contact with that type of water in a second? Let's just say hypothetically you're able to get everything out. You then have to cut the drywall or plaster or wall paneling or whatever the finished wall material is out, remove all of the baseboards, finish carpentry, door casings, door trim, at least, a foot above the water line. And, just because you may see a resting water line in the house where the water settled doesn't mean that through capillary action, it didn't absorb up into the walls even higher. And in some cases, all the way to the ceiling or into the ceiling. So you have to be aggressive in regards to removing that material, putting equipment in, dehumidifiers and fans and things like that. If you reach out to a company and that's their approach, I'd question what they're trying to salvage. That's why I'm a bit skeptical when people come in and try to fill your house full of equipment right away, and then slowly start to figure out what they're going to remove. There is no saving this material. It's all got to come out.
Mm-hmm.
You can try to dry the structure later, but first and foremost, you have to remove the building material from inside the home. Insulation, drywall, finished carpentry, floor coverings. Yes, your tile that's been submerged in black water should come up. Just because it's waterproof or water resistant material doesn't mean moisture can't get under it. And, outside of textured concrete and terrazzo, I don't know, there isn't a floor covering I personally would feel comfortable leaving in place, regardless of how commercially viable you think it is. It should come out. And then you can kind of focus on trying to get the structure dry. You don't need to fill the house full of 20 pieces of equipment. You need some general dehumidification and some general air movement, and over time the block and the structure will dry down. And in that process, the areas that have been exposed to that water need to be cleaned and decontaminated. So if you find yourself in that position, if you're not worried about chemical sensitivity, you need to get aggressive in using some of the harsher chemicals out there to try to kill some biolife and bacterias and things like that. That's counterintuitive to what we do in the mold industry. But when you're dealing with pathogens in water, unfortunately, you're going to have to use some chemicals that can be aggressive enough to ultimately clean and treat those areas. There are other products, peroxides, and some of your off the shelf stuff, like Cloroxes and Lysols and things like that. All will do a good job of trying to kill some of that bacteria and some of that biolife. But that needs to be done sometimes several times before you're ready to consider putting the building back together again. If you don't have access to companies like us, of course.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And that's the tricky thing after something like this, is it can be very hard to find a company that's available to get out there quickly enough to do all this. So, and you're probably not going to have power for several days after an event like this. So the number one thing is, like you said, getting everything out of that house. And this is the only time I'll ever advocate for DIY, right? Sometimes you have no other choice, because you got to get that building material out within 72 hours, in my opinion.
No, it's an industry opinion. It's the approach you have to take, unless and you are hopefully salvaging quite a bit of material from the flood line up. But the longer it sits there, especially with no power, wet, the higher of the likelihood not only the areas that got wet are going to have to be torn out, but all the rest of the materials as well. Because you have a pond in your home and you have no dehumidification and no power, and you have that wet material just sitting in there, you will most certainly also have a pretty significant mold problem on top of the problem you have with the black water soaked material. So there is value in mitigating quickly. There's value in getting that wet material out of there promptly, and then getting some level of drying equipment in there or air movement in there to start drying the structure down. because then you can salvage the rest of the material in there and you're only kind of dealing with flood line down. Unfortunately, that's where most of the value is in a home. I've had a lot of calls and people not arguing with me, but that are hesitant to be as aggressive as you should be. Water is going to get behind the walls and the cabinets. Water is going to get behind your showers and under your showers and under the pans and into those wall cavities. It will soak in. You just had a pool in your home of the worst type of water, and so it will find its way into those areas. And it's wishful thinking to think that it isn't. And same goes with your floor covering. So, like I said, if you want to be thorough, want to do it the right way, you're ultimately tearing those areas out as well. And I get it. That's a enormous expense.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a 1-story home and you're tearing out your kitchen and all your bathrooms, I more than feel for you. I'm sick for you, especially if you're not insured properly. And even if you are insured properly, it's still a unthinkable thing to have to do that to your home. And I think about all those people who couldn't possibly do it themselves. The elderly, the people who live, without the means,
mm-hmm.
don't have the financial means, and we have programs like FEMA to hopefully make up for some of the gaps that are in our system and in our society. But I do want to speak to all those people out there who have been helping. I mean, there are so many people who have no stake in it, who are out there doing what they could to help others in a time of disaster. I don't care how many stories you see about it, there isn't enough. There's just so many people out there lending a hand. And
it's truly awesome to see the best of people in these situations. It's crazy that it takes something like this to see that, but you're right. It's been awesome to see. But you just brought up insurance. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Just given your background, is there any benefit or disadvantage to somebody going ahead and tearing things out DIY to get that wet material out as quickly as possible? Is there a disadvantage to that? I mean, I'd always encourage people to document things as they go. In these situations, you can't take enough pictures of your personal belongings. There's just not enough pictures you could take. But is there any disadvantage to it from the insurance side of things?
I'll say this, and I don't want anybody to take this as legal advice, because every policy is different. Every carrier is different. Some carriers are hesitant to instruct their homeowners to do anything until they get a chance to evaluate it and see it. But by and large, in my experience, and the policy is a 2-way contract typically, right? You have an insurance policy, it's a contract. It says that you also have duties under the contract to mitigate, to try to stop further damage from occurring. And from my experience, and so far from what I've heard, those who have insurance policies and that are properly insured for these types of events, the insurance companies are pretty much expecting them to mitigate and do what we've discussed to try to stave off further damage. I think the difficulty comes where people have policies that have exclusions or limitations, or they were underinsured or weren't insured properly to begin with. And they're finding themselves in situations where they're getting a lot of a lot of kickback or feedback or issues dealing with their insurance carrier. So, starting with being properly insured in the first place, and that obviously helps no one who's in the situation right now where they they find themselves in a situation where they weren't, or finding out their carrier is just not willing to deal with it properly, which I'm hearing stories, of just flat out denials on things that people think they were insured for, should have been insured for. Those situations aside, one of the practices that isn't talked about enough, because we do have some benefit when these storms are coming. We know they're coming. We all want to assume that it won't be us, but what I like to tell people is it's the time to document before the storm is even close. Time to unfortunately to check your policy to make sure you're insured is before the storm ever exists.
That's a great point, because I've learned over the last few weeks how many people, and I'm guilty of this too, to be honest with you, have no idea what's covered and what isn't under their policy.
No. And Sean, if I wasn't in this industry or wasn't a former insurance adjuster, I would be the same exact way. I cannot fault people for not knowing. It is a legal contract. And if you're not, used to reading those contracts, they're like any other legal contract. It takes almost an attorney to figure out what the language actually means in a lot of cases. And we used to live in a society where you could go down and talk to your agent. Your agent would say, would explain it to you and say, no, you are properly insured. I've looked out for you. You can do those types of things. And maybe that still exists in some places. In some respects, you can still get people to help you navigate to make sure, based on what your home, where it's at, what the value is, what the type of coverage you have is, are you protected for these types of events? There's a lot of people who aren't in flood zones who probably should still have flood insurance. And so I think that people are finding that out now. And of course, we have an insurance epidemic in the state right now, and even getting properly insured or finding somebody who will insure you is an issue for a lot of people too. So for those who don't know, if there's a storm out in the Gulf or any named storm out there anywhere, I should say, that has the potential to come to your area, you can't do anything to your policy. Nothing. It's essentially locked in place. From my experience, maybe things have changed, but from my understanding is once it's out there, you can make no changes. You can't be like, crap, there's a storm coming. The news says that it may hit my area. I need to call my insurance agent and make sure I've added the coverage I need to protect myself. From my experience, they're gonna tell you, unfortunately, we can't make any changes to policies right now until these storms go away. So you need to make sure you're properly insured well ahead of time for these types of events, because like a house fire, this is a devastating situation that can leave you without house and home. And if you decide to risk living in these areas that are high risk, and I would argue that most of the state is at least semi high risk, and then anywhere near bodies of water I would consider high risk at this point, you should do whatever you can to make sure you're protected and you protect what's probably your biggest asset.
Yeah, and I would love if there's anybody that's been through this before and had to deal with the insurance company, if you could share some helpful tips for people from their experience, that help you get covered. I'd love for you to share that on YouTube comments or somewhere on our Instagram page. Just give people tips on how to approach this, because I feel like I'm learning something new when it comes to the insurance side of things every day. It seems like these policies are constantly changing what they are and are not willing to cover. So I just feel like that's one area that people are just kind of left totally in the dark on, and they're having to figure things out themselves.
Yeah, and I won't dare get into politics on this show, but I will say that our policies cover less and less every year. Our premiums
go up and up,
continue to go up and up every year. Trying to find coverage is more difficult year by year. And so, those changes are made because they're allowed to be made. We're all having to deal with the after effects. I was lucky enough to be able to come home to my home, but it makes me question a lot. And even I, am not as intimately engaged in what my policy covers and doesn't cover. I found out post storm that doesn't cover. None of my outbuildings have coverage, which I assumed I did have coverage for. but because they weren't a part of the original survey, they weren't included on there. And I have, a significant amount of money invested in all my outbuildings, and if they were blown away or blown down or lost or flooded or washed away, I'd be devastated as well. So, I don't,
You'd
trust
lose your
me.
studio, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would lose the studio. None of this is meant to be critical of anyone. If you're watching this and you're in this situation, I can't, like I said, I really can't blame anybody. But this needs to be talked about more. We have to educate ourselves as a community to be prepared for these types of events if they come in the future. We'll have plenty of other shows talking about what to do to maybe protect your home if possible. There's certain things based on how your home is constructed and where it's located at that you won't be able to do. And you probably know that if you're in that situation right now. But there are a lot of people who can protect their homes better and ultimately build with materials that may be easier to prep and protect for. I'll give you one example. I looked at a house that was a 3-story home, garage underneath, near the water. Second and third floor are the living living quarters, but down below they have a significant amount of living space down there as well in the area that's technically in the flood area, and the beach just washed into this homeowner's home. Pool completely sand now. You can't even see the pool anymore. It's underground, and all that washed into the garage and into the interior of their first floor, which is tied into their house. There's elevator shaft, whole bathroom, fully built out garage, and only thing down there that's even possibly water resistant is the exterior block walls. Everything else down there is made of your standard interior drywall material, and ultimately, what was affected. And in retrospect, you probably don't want to build like that in a space like that. That's supposed to be, an area that if it gets wet can still protect the remainder of the environment. And so there's a lot of people out there now that I think realize that, because they're having to gut a portion of the house that probably shouldn't have been finished the way it was finished. That's just one small example out there. The people who are on slab single family dwellings out there, the older buildings out there, man, it was not if but when something like this was going to occur, because there's really not a whole lot you can do to protect a home like that when it's when the ocean is in your backyard and ultimately rises into your home.
Yeah, but even neighborhoods away from the water, there's a lot of things I've learned over the last couple of weeks of homes I probably wouldn't.
Your area specifically.
Yeah, because all these low-lying areas and neighborhoods are the homes that got hit hard. So, stuff where if you just looked around, it's easy to do in the moment, but you look around and you can just visualize where all the water runoff came from just by looking at the grading of the neighborhood itself. And the houses that were in the lower parts of these neighborhoods are the ones that flooded. So, if you're out looking for a home and you want to be conscious of these things, you want to try to figure out if those areas have ever flooded before. It may have only been one or two times, but you don't want it to be one of those times while you own the property. So look at how the water runoff is all graded in these neighborhoods and just be conscious of those type of things.
Yeah, I think people now are going to be much more wary of purchasing homes. It starts with that. You may cosmetically be in love with the home and the community, but equally as important, is it in harm's way? What are the historical events that have occurred in those areas that I don't think anybody asks? The banks don't ask it, the lenders don't ask it, the realtors don't ask it. It's not on typically any type of inspection report, as far as I know. And outside of you doing your own research, finding out about previous events, because 10 years from now, if we don't sustain any future events, a lot of this is going to be forgotten. Not for those who have suffered. You'll never forget, and you will always live with a reminder of what occurred. But for those who watch these episodes in the future, or are thinking about moving or investing and all those types of things, man, it all starts with that, right? You need to make sure that you're in an area that, if you are buying in an area of risk, that you're protected. If you're building in an area of risk, that you're building with that in mind, and knowing that it's maybe not if, but when you could potentially sustain that type of damage, so you can lessen the blow after the fact. Something like this, though, it's hard, right? If it makes its way into the interior of your building, ultimately it doesn't really matter what you built the interior of the building out of, unless it's just completely commercial block walls and unfinished concrete floors. You're still going to have to remove a lot of the wet materials. This goes back to one of the things we talk about a lot, which is I talk about building kitchens and cabinets commercially all the time. The usage of non-porous metal or other synthetic type of materials or detachable type situations where you can actually remove them and get them to higher areas, is something more and more people should consider. It's not customary. You don't see it a whole lot, but being around what me and Sean and anybody else in this industry is around, it won't seem like such an extreme thing when you see what has to happen after an event like this.
Yeah. And that it's probably seems like a very, very serious episode with us here, that I don't feel like we've been our normal selves, bringing out the personality stuff, but
man.
we've just seen so much devastation over the last month between these two hurricanes. And we want to make sure people are just educated if this ever happened to them. And again, it doesn't have to just be hurricanes, any type of event. I mean, people deal with natural disasters all over the place, all over the world. So we just want to make sure you're educated and prepared. And from my standpoint, I just want people to take the dry out process seriously. We have to dry the home out, or do our best to anyway, in those first few days. Because I still work with people from hurricanes years ago where they had flooding, and sure enough, these storm chasing companies did not take the proper measures to dry out the property. And we have significant mold issues in the home, and people are sick years later. So we just want...
Man, you bring up I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but you bring up a serious discussion. This has been a serious show, and for good reason. It needs to be. But if you find yourself purchasing a property in this state, that has somehow been affected by these storms, been flooded, you buy a house that one of the flooded houses, man, do you ever want to know in detail what was done to mitigate those properties? Because if there were half measures taken, and if they didn't remove all the material they were supposed to, because they were trying to save costs, especially the big money areas like the bathrooms, the showers, and the kitchens, and the flooring, those are the areas, it seems like, on a continual basis, I'm talking to people on a daily basis in communities where they're like, yeah, my neighbor didn't remove their tile floors. Yeah, my neighbor didn't remove their shower. Yeah, my neighbor's insurance company said it wasn't necessary. So be extremely weary of purchasing these buildings unless you're fully aware of what was done to mitigate them in the first place. Go ahead, Sean. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. You kind of finished my thought there, so that's perfectly fine. Again, can't stress enough how important it is to dry it out and get these materials out as quickly as possible. And it's painful. The most painful conversations the last few weeks have probably been from people like you, Adam, who own those older historical homes, and they love the charm of the home, and they don't want to They don't want a demo. They want to keep that charm. But you have to.
Yeah.
You have to.
I'd have a tough time if it was me and I had no clue and I was in a different industry. I'd have a really, really tough time with people telling me, I need to tear my bathrooms and showers out. My brick chimney area. I've got a lot of there's certain things that ultimately, materials go behind it. And, so you're talking about taking a laser line and spinning it and imagining it just making a cut and all those materials that are non-structural coming out. That's essentially what you have to do in buildings like this. If those areas took on water, which in most cases you're talking about, a pretty equal level making its way throughout, the bottom floor of your property. If you have a 2-story home, it's unlikely the upstairs did, but still, yeah, we're going to talk about it, ad nauseum, but getting those materials out is how it begins, because, drying it in place, ultimately, you're going to find that down the road, you probably didn't dry it like you thought you would. And not only do you have materials that have saturated, contaminated water, but probably now have a pretty significant mold issue behind those materials as well, because it's sat wet for a significant period of time. Not only that, the structural materials behind it, where you don't typically see a lot of growth on block and framing. If it sits wet long enough, you'll get a significant amount on those materials as well. So yeah, man, if you take anything from this show, the removal of material, it's really non-negotiable when you're talking about how to mitigate from a loss like this.
Agreed. Couldn't have said it better. But we had Mitzi on. We talked about one of our goals being creating a community with this show.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be one of our goals. So if you're listening and you want to share crazy videos from the storm on our Instagram page, we're more than happy to share those. If you want to give just motivational or inspirational advice, or just let people know that are affected, that you're thinking about them, they're for them, you understand what they're going through, please comment on our videos. Please comment on our Instagram page. I know there's people that read through those comments, just looking for that little bit of motivation.
Yeah. We've all, I think I've learned from this process. Like you said at the beginning, you asked me if I'd seen anything like this, and it's been a while since I've been around it, and completely different when it's right in your backyard, and it has affected people I know and love. People I know and love have lost everything and are still out of their homes, and who knows when they'll ever be able to get back in them, because they're still picking up the pieces and trying to figure out how they're going to pay for it and all those things. I think the vast majority of us, though, who aren't in that situation, have to ask themselves, am I prepared? And what can I do to prepare better in case, something like this were to occur? You can save your belongings, if you prepare. Structurally, you may be able to do a lot to prepare, especially with the windstorm side of things, like Milton. For a lot of people, that it got more affected because we didn't have the storm surges, but we did have the rising water in communities like yours. There were still an issue. So there was still some flooding from that, but that's a different type of exposure for a lot of people. Wind-driven rain coming in sideways at 100 plus miles per hour, blowing up into your soffits, soaking the insulation from above, finding its way down into your walls. Even if your house is block below, it's most likely frame above. And so you maybe find yourself in the situation where you may be able to dry those areas out if you know how your building is constructed. Can you remove some material, remove some insulation, get some air movement and dehumidification into those spaces and salvage the majority of the materials? Possibly. That's where you really will have to lean on an expert who has the equipment, moisture meters, thermal cameras, things like that, so they can identify the areas that got wet and ultimately come up with a plan of action in order to help you mitigate, those areas and get them dry.
Yeah, I'm going to try to share some of my videos from the storm, hopefully at the end of the podcast here, so people can get an idea of what those winds were like, because I feel like it's hard to comprehend until you actually experience it. We've lived through our whole lives basically and never experienced anything like we did a couple weeks ago. And if anybody else has some crazy videos that they took, share them with us. That way people can get a better idea of what we went through, how serious it is, and how serious it is to be prepared for a storm like that.
Yeah, if you found us, you're already looking for answers, or you've been affected currently or in the past, and you can utilize the community that we have and us as a resource. If you have any questions on where to go and how to handle certain situations, definitely reach out to us. We don't always have all the answers, and in a lot of cases we may refer you to areas, or people who have different levels of expertise in other areas. That's how we can all help each other get through this situation. And of course, in the future, if you find out you sustain damage or buy a building that sustained damage and ultimately want it mitigated, properly or tested to see if it requires some type of mitigation, of course, you can always reach out to us as well.
Yeah, as always, our information will be in the video or podcast description. So you can always find our websites and our contact info there. Feel free to reach out. We're trying to help as many people as we can right now. Hopefully we can get back to a little sense of normalcy here in the next couple of weeks. It probably won't be that quick, but hopefully we can start, I don't want to say moving on.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's how these things happen. Whether you want to or not, over time, we all have to move on from these things and get through these situations. And a lot of times discussion is one of the better ways to help kind of cope with the traumas that we've all dealt with. I know it is for me, and just kind of coming on here and talking about it. And as you know, I'm tend to be a little bit on the jovial side, but it's been traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's no way to sugarcoat it. I've really I've really seen a lot of devastation, and I know a lot of people have as well, in person, on television, calls from their neighbors and loved ones, knowing people who've been directly affected and displaced. And, a lot of people have just had to have their families move in while they're waiting to get lights and power and, food back. I found myself
that was me
out on the streets, like Mad Max, scrounging for fuel in the middle of the night, trying to get some additional fuel for my generators and my vehicles. So wild times, never forget it. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more on future episodes, and maybe have a couple of you guys on to talk about your experience if you're willing, because we can talk about it, but hearing it from somebody who's lived it or is currently living it is a completely different situation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are one of those people, or somebody who is, even if it's to come on here to ask for help or look for additional help and resources, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, hopefully we can get another episode out here in the near future too, because like we said, what happened the last couple of weeks definitely pushed us back. So hopefully we can get back on track and hopefully knock one out here sooner than the normal 2 weeks.
Absolutely. As always, we appreciate you guys tuning in. We will see you soon, and hopefully we'll be in much better spirits, because my favorite part is seeing people bounce back from this type of stuff, and having seen already a lot of people getting through and fighting through these situations, it gives me hope for sure. So look forward to the next one, man.
Yeah, but as always, thanks for listening to the Mold Show. We'll see you on the next one. Good night.
See you on the next one. Good night.